Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Green Recovery Post-COVID-19, European or National Strategies. We are grateful to our moderator, Dr. Anna Creedy, and our distinguished panelists for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services you can find on our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderator. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have any questions for our panelists, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window and type your question. We have allocated sufficient time at the end of this webinar to answer your questions. And now I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Dr. Anna Creedy, Professor, University Dauphine. Anna? Over to you.
Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon for those joining from Europe. Thanks for being here. This webinar is actually much more a debate. Today in France, we celebrate the Victory Day. I think that tomorrow it will be the case in Spain. It has been the case also, it has been already the case in Italy on April 25. But I assure you, this is not a webinar about the history of Europe. Nevertheless, those specificities of Europe are very important to understand what we are going to discuss. In Europe, we have a common framework, which maybe is not yet completely developed, and we still have national policies. Of course, the virus did not recognize those differences. So we are all in together facing this crisis. And also the response has been different in terms of decision of public health and what it is more important for this seminar on the economic response that we are going to give in order to exit the crisis. This is particularly relevant now with Italy, Spain, and France in a few days, exiting also the lockdown. And what we see in general is that there is an intense debate that is going on from the side of professionals, academia, NGOs, and we all are having a common idea that the recovery has to be green or it won't be. On the political side, what we see is that the response is somehow, I would say, a little bit lagging behind. This may be perhaps because, I mean, our politicians are in somehow very busy in understanding how we can end the lockdown. But maybe it reveals some uncertainties. And on the back of this national diversity, we also see an important debate going on at the European level. Just before the lockdown and the health crisis, we had this idea of the Green Deal. That now has to be perhaps adapted to what is going on. So those are the main questions that we are going to debate. That is why we have to talk about a green recovery, which is the difference between a recovery plan that we may have already experienced after the crisis of 2008, or do we modify the Green Deal? Are we able to coordinate the national action in a time that is so important and to achieve some major sustainability goals? Of course, in France, we are really, we do care about that because we think that this is something that the unique opportunity of catching up with the Paris Agreement. So I will start the debate just giving the virtual floor to Patrice, who is going to tell us and explain us exactly this point. That is, what it is different in the green recovery plan that we are advocating. So I leave Patrice taking.
Okay, I'm trying to share my screen. I hope this is the case for everyone. So from good morning to good evening to everyone. I'm really happy to have that discussion with you. And the kind of idea I would like to share with you is quite obvious from my point of view. In fact, in Europe and in many parts of the world, but especially in Europe, we are at the end of a decade which have been very complex. For example, if we consider the French case, between 2007 and now, we have observed the growth of the debt on GDP by 35, maybe 40% and more after the COVID crisis. But at the same time, that decade has been very fascinating, considering the fact that we have been able in Europe to have that debate as regard the way to implement the Paris Agreement, and we still have that debate as regard that carbon neutrality objective for 2050. And then at the end of that debate, there is an additional constraint related to the COVID crisis and its potential impact in economic terms, considering the constraint that we already had at the end of that decade. And especially this is the case in France, in Italy, in Spain, which are gathered in that webinar. And then the pitch of what I would like to share with you is quite simple. Considering all that constraint, if we want to implement the Green Deal, we have to modify the way we count the benefits of that kind of policy. And with the same kind of measure, we need both to tackle economic leverage, but at the same time, environmental leverage, and at the same time, maybe more and more in the future, considering what we live now, health issue. And I will simply in a few slides try to enter a bit more in the detail of that kind of policy. And first of all, we need to go back to what we did in 2008. And first observation, so when you go to the negative side or to the positive side, to the negative side, it means that in the recovery plan that have been implementing, and it was the case in Italy, sorry Anna, most of that investment had a long-term negative impact as regard the climate action. For example, in the case of Italy, it represented investment in road building, and in some other cases, for example, it was the case of France. Most of what has been implemented at that period had, let's say, neutral effect on the climate action. For example, we have invested in energy efficiency, but with norms that were not enough ambitious to have a positive long-term effect as regard our commitment to 2020, and we can make the same kind of observation as regard support for the core industry. And then the basic idea is to say that we cannot afford doing that for the future, considering collectively in Europe our economic constraint, and that first of all, we need to finance investment that will contribute to the economic dynamics of Europe. This is obvious because we will be in front, maybe, and probably, and unfortunately could be the case in Italy, in Spain, in France, in front of unemployment issue. And what we know, and many studies leads to the same conclusion. That one is a very recent one provided by arena is that the potential gain that we will get from investment in low carbon technologies will represent in Europe the most impressive leverage. Behind that, there are different reasons that relates to the industrial networks of Europe, and that relates also to the fact that each day, last year and the years before, we imported 1 billion euro each day of roughly oil products and also of gas. And then that path to carbon neutrality could produce that leverage. And then if we invest as we did in 2008, then we will not gain that kind of return on investment from an economic point of view. Here, this is the same story, but expressed in terms of GDP per people. And what we observe is the fact that there are no other part of the world where that kind of leverage could be so impressive at the individual level and globally in terms of GDP gain. So first co-benefit, which will be at the center of the public debates in Europe in economic terms. Second one, improving energy security. Maybe that we could believe that, considering the fact that the oil price is very low and even in some recent episode in US negative, maybe that we could make a kind of strange bet for the future in considering that a recovery plane could be, let's say, gray, considering the fact that the oil price will stay low over the long term. First of all, this is a bet, and if we observe what occurred in the past, for example, between 2008 and 2009, we observe, first of all, a drop from 140 USD per barrel to somewhere around 40 USD, but with a rapid rebound, and we stay at that level higher than 100 USD per barrel during a few years, and after that period of drop, we observe a second rebound. That rebound, which is here in autumn 2008, is, let's say, interesting in the French history, because this was the beginning of the so-called yellow vest movement, and with a massive social impact leading to massive political instability and massive economic consequences. And then my very simple idea is to say that we need to keep in mind what we have learned from the last decade, and especially that, first of all, we are not involved in the debate as regard, in the negotiation as regard the future price of oil, which are debated between Saudi Arabia, Russia, and now the United States, but without any European nation invited to that negotiation. And then for the future, we could be in front of that kind of rebound. And only for France, just to share with you an order of magnitude, if we consider the difference between that year, it was in 2012, and that year where the oil price was at its lower level, the difference in terms of import is around 40 billion euros, and it represents 1.5% of the French GDP. And more in some other European countries, you are here data represented the degree of dependence as regard oil import. Last remark, which was not supposed to be part of that kind of discussion a few weeks ago before the beginning of that crisis, but a vision which is more and more debated, is that we need also to be able to capture the local co-benefits in environmental terms and in health as regard the health issue for European citizens. And this is one of the co-benefits of the climate action. Roughly, if we were able in the future to continue to lower the use of fossil fuel and especially of coal, then we would improve the air quality in Europe, and with an impressive level in terms of GDP. Here you have some recent data provided by OECD and tending to analyze what has been the impact during the 2 last decades of the improvement of the air quality, and in front of us we could have the same kind of collective benefits. Once again, just to give you an order of magnitude, the air pollution in France, which is not the worst part of Europe, especially because we don't use roughly any more coal. And then even if a country like France, the yearly cost of air pollution is around 2% of GDP, let's say around 50 billion euro, and leading to 50,000 deaths for a normal year, and that year due to COVID is not normal, obviously. And then my last observation will be to say this is something that we have learned from our present history, and we need to take it into account in the way we will design our recovery plan all over Europe. And this is an additional reason from my point of view to continue to define an ambitious Green Deal. Anna, I give you back the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. I allow myself a first remark about Italy, because I mean it was so bad that I had to somehow explain why we in 2008 we were still busy at building roads. I think that it was the opportunity for Italy to close the gap between some infrastructures in the north and in the south. So I guess that the analysis you have done is on the ground of pure efficiency and therefore also the impact on emissions. Nevertheless, I think that there was also a benefit in terms of, I would say, perhaps redistribution. So this is also something that we may want to discuss later on, because one of the issues also of the Green Deal is what we call the just transition. And just to complete also this remark, I have said that the response of the governments to this COVID crisis is somehow I don't know if it is weak, but it is not yet organized. In Italy, since I'm not sure I'm going to have time to explain much more, but in Italy we had the first action that has taken place exactly in the south in order to get some huge subsidies to reconvert to regions that whose economy is actually very dependent on 2 big coal plants. So the balance, and this has been financed also by this Just Transition Fund decided by Europe. So the idea of redistribution and taking also the opportunity of the Green Deal to leverage these effects is one part, I think, of the debate. Exactly on this point, as I was saying, that national responses are also going back and forth and saying, no, it is a national issue, no, it is a European one. Does Europe recognize all those co-benefits that you have explained? And so how it is the reality from the point of view of Europe? I think that Thomas is the one that is going to highlight those issues. So Thomas works at the Delos Institute, and he has exactly this point of view of the European policies. And I'm giving you the floor, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Anna. I think one first thing we need to recognize is the speed of the EU action. Usually, regularly, the European Union is criticized for being an organization that decides very slowly, and it is true that it does. But at least, in the end, there are EU decisions. While, for instance, in other democracies, especially in the US, sometimes there is a struggle to find a decision, or at least when it comes to legislation. Here, the EU has responded quite swiftly if we compare that to the, let's say, very, very slow EU response to the financial crisis of 2008. Maybe just to give you an example. So most of the European countries have a single currency, which is the euro. And during the last financial crisis, we, roughly speaking, had to wait for 4 years for the European Central Bank to really do something that solved the monetary part of the equation, while here it has essentially been done in a couple of weeks, already in the middle of March. Now, looking at the fiscal policy, I think there is now an agreement politically on the idea to make a big EU and national fiscal stimulus, focusing on two key transitions, the green transition and the digital transition. And at least in my opinion, this is a political battle that was waged for a couple of weeks now, and that is now won. Now, when it comes to the speeches, everybody is calling for a green recovery, and even Poland, which is traditionally the most reluctant country in Europe when it comes to green policies, to our American friends on the other side of the Atlantic, it's a little bit like Kentucky. Even Poland now has developed a green recovery plan, or is developing a green recovery plan. So where we are now at the EU level is really trying to dive into the sectors. I think now everybody agrees in Europe that a green stimulus is a good idea. But now the debate is really about whether a green stimulus can actually work to stimulate the economy. And the debate that is currently happening in Brussels, the capital of the European Union, but also in the different member states, so in Paris, in Berlin, in Madrid, is to what extent can we invest? So how many tens of billions, hundreds of billions of euros can we invest in specific green sectors? Is it school renovation? Is it charging points for electric vehicles? Is it scaling up solar panels, etc., etc.? So how many billions can we invest? Where? And who should do the investment? And this will be obviously a big debate between those who say that it should be the EU level, those who say it should be at the national level. And it's obviously, one of those debates you always have in a federation, where there's the federal level or the state level that should be acting. Back to you, Anna.
Yes, thank you. When you were talking, I was trying to make some calculations, because the amount of money that we have to spend is so huge that the question is, are we sure that we can manage to get the balance, or should we somehow decide that everything it has been done so far, the Stability Pact and so on and so forth, has to be rediscussed too?
Well, so the European Stability Pact was adopted decades ago and has been revised several times. And it essentially says that in normal times, you should aim for zero deficit and at least make sure that you don't have a deficit that is beyond 3% of the GDP. But under EU law, this is obviously just for normal times, and there are exceptional clauses as part of the Stability and Growth Pact, and those have been activated. So essentially, it means that for the next, at least for this year, but also maybe the next year or the next 2 years, so as long as the crisis continues, EU member states are free to spend as they want. What they need to do, however, is to develop national programs that are submitted to the EU to make sure that they do respect EU law, especially when it comes to state aid, and so to make sure that they really invest in a way that is good for the economy and not in a way that would be harmful for the fair competition between EU member states.
I have a question for you, just waiting from the floor, and in the meantime, have a personal one, because you said exactly that there is this idea of state aid that is one of the big component of the competition policy in Europe. So what about the fact that, well, France has already, if I'm correct, promised huge subsidies to the automobile industry, Renault, and the aviation to Air France, but without any kind of, again, correct me if I'm wrong, of constraints in terms of environmental and social and governance criteria or environmental investment. Are those subsidies being accepted, or are they somehow can be rediscussed by the European law?
To answer your question, I think we should clarify maybe 3 different phases of the crisis. The first phase, where we are now, is the rescue phase. And here we're talking about bailouts, for instance, as being a key element of the rescue. A second phase, which will start in the coming month, is, once you have rescued the economy, you need to make sure that the economy recovers. And during this second stage, so far, all the ideas that have been put around are just ideas. Nothing legislative has been proposed yet. And the first organization to go out to discuss, to propose in details a recovery program will be the European Commission, who is meant to make its proposal in the coming 2 or 3 weeks. And then there's a third phase that is about consolidation. How do you make sure that once the economy has been rescued, once the economy has recovered, how do you ensure the consolidation of the economy, but also the consolidation of public debt? And the issue of environmental conditionality, in my view, needs to be very different depending on those 3 phases. So in short, it's hard to do a lot of strict environmental consolidation for the rescue, because you need to decide urgently, and there are a lot of jobs at stake, and it's politically difficult. But you can do at least some minimum. So for instance, the minimum when you bail out an airline company would be to say, guys, business leaders, I give you 12 months to provide me with a plan of what your business looks like in a climate neutral world. So what does Air France, as an airline company, what does Air France do in 2050 in a climate neutral world, which is a really challenging question for airline companies. Then for the recovery, here you can put a lot of environmental strings attached. In essence, I think it's fair to say that we could even do all the economic recovery just by investing in green stuff. There is now big enough markets, big enough investment needs to do the recovery only with green investments. I'm not saying that we should do that. I'm saying that we could do that if we want to, but obviously there are other things like public health or digital where it also makes sense to invest in the recovery. And finally, for the consolidation, we can here have 100% green consolidation. So first, you start by raising taxes on things that do pollute. And that would be, for instance, a way to have a sort of green fiscal consolidation. But here we're already talking about, post-crisis. So hopefully as soon as 2024, 2025.
Thank you very much. I have 2 questions from the audience. The 3 of us, you are invited also to give ideas. One is about the euro and the Eurozone. One of our guests says whether going back to national currencies is going to help people working, producing, and living. So somehow I interpret this by saying, which is the optimal monetary policy that we have to adopt in this crisis time. And the other one is, it is about investing in some specific sectors, and the threat that there will be distortion in terms of competition between sectors, technologies, or even countries. So on what those two issues are issues of coordination and how do we harmonize national goals and policies with the European ones. Maybe Patrice or Thomas?
Yes, I think that as regard the first question, the question is maybe a bit different because there is an additional one from the same person saying could we obtain complementary regional currency. And as far as I understand the question, the issue is not really whether we should move from euro to national currency, but to add regional and maybe local at the, for example, for Paris or Madrid, as to dynamize the economic activity. And I'm not a specialist of that question. I simply would like to say that there are some new experiments in that domain based, for example, on blockchain, and that can be also combined with climate actions, because in fact, people can be engaged in activities that may have a positive payback locally, especially in environmental terms. And from that point of view, gauge a kind of payback that can be exchanged. But at the same time, what we are observing, and I'm sure that Thomas has in his own idea, is that presently the main institutional player in that crisis is the European Central Bank. And then from that point of view, the question was, would we be more robust with national currency in France, Italy, and Spain? I'm not sure that it would be the case. If the question is, would it be positive to add some kind of regional currencies as to organize a circular economic system or shorter circuits? It is something which is, from my point of view, quite interesting, but very difficult to experiment directly in the middle of a crisis.
Yeah, if I could just add one more thing here, I'm going to share my screen just to show you one slide, which is which is a slide that shows you the level of the fiscal response between EU member states. And what I really want you to focus on is this graph here, the red graph. And what you see here is what has been the size of the fiscal response of all the EU member states so far. And what is really interesting are, in my view, two things. The first is that you see that there's a huge diversity between a country like Germany that invests more than 4%, actually even 5% of their GDP already, and other countries like Portugal or Sweden or even Spain that invest less than 1%. So that's the first takeaway here, is that the fiscal response is very diverse between countries, which is a bad thing actually in a way, because we have a symmetric shock, but we have an asymmetric fiscal response, and so there will be asymmetric consequences. The second takeaway here is that the countries that are doing the most are not the countries that are the hardest hit. If you take a country like Germany or Poland, they are doing a lot in terms of fiscal response, even if they are only, let's say, moderately impacted by COVID, because Germany and Poland are, for instance, far less impacted by COVID than Italy or Spain. So what is the takeaway here? Obviously, it's not that the Italian and the Spanish governments are crazy. It's simply that they don't have the fiscal space to do what is needed. So Germany and Poland are doing that because they do have the fiscal space for that. Spain and Italy do not have all the fiscal space that they need. So what should be the answer? So part of the answer was already given by the European Central Bank, which is to make sure that countries can go on the market and borrow money at a very low interest rate. And so, by the way, the interest rate for Italy is below 1%. The interest rate for a country like France, for instance, is even a negative interest rate for 10 years bond. And the second part of the answer, which is very, very, very much debated currently in Europe, is about which kind of burden sharing do we have at the European level? In other words, can we go on the market as EU, as a European Union, to borrow money as a European Union, so as a de facto federation, and then inside, the European Union club, do zero interest loans between the EU level and specific member states that are the hardest hit by the crisis. There is really a general agreement on that. The only person really that is blocking the decision here is the Dutch finance minister, who does that for internal political reasons, on which I can elaborate if you want to.
Thank you both of you. Before elaborating that, it's interesting to have the point of view of Lara. So we just heard about that the Italian and Spanish countries maybe share some concerns. So what we can say from the Spanish side?
Thank you, Anna, and thank you to the International Association of Energy Economics for having me. It's great to be here. I'm just going to share my screen very briefly. And hopefully you'll be able to see a bit of the stats, because yes, the situation in Spain is quite dire. It's one of the countries that, as you know, has been worst hit by COVID-19. In Europe, we have over 218,000 people being infected, with over 25,000 people dead. The estimates from the Bank of Spain in terms of the GDP growth for this year, and depending on the scenarios and on the type of modeling, they give us a range of a drop between 6.6% and 13.6%. The latest estimates that the Spanish government sent to Europe are a drop in 9.1, 9.2%. That is compounded with what we are expecting from our increase in unemployment rate. We ended 2019 with an unemployment rate of 13.7%, and we are expecting this unemployment rate to go up to over 16% this year. So we are in dire straits. We know that our economic structure is very dependent on the construction sector and tourism, and on the transport sector, and these are, as you know, have been very heavily affected. So in terms of Spain's reaction, and this is not only for Spain, but also for countries like certain short-term reactions have been shared by other countries in Europe, we have introduced temporary interest-free tax deferrals, suspended enforcement of some debt contracts, put in place some cash transfer, especially for people who have lost their jobs, and small and medium-sized enterprises. We've expanded the eligibility for unemployment and offered loan guarantees. You were talking about the sectoral approach having won the narrative at the European level of a green recovery, how now we have to sort of think about drilling down into the sectors and the impact that's going to have. Well, from the government, we expect to see greater emphasis in the coming weeks and months in terms of construction, transport, urban planning, power, and energy-intensive industry. So the thing that is significantly different for Spain and for other countries, but for Spain for sure, is that we have an NECP, a National Energy and Climate Change Plan, that is the roadmap that the government seeks to follow. So all of the European countries have these roadmaps. These might have to be updated, but it's a significant difference to 2008. In terms of construction, we are aiming really high in Spain. The NECP says we're going to do deep renovations of 300,000 houses per year. This is a rate that we have never achieved before, so there are hurdles to overcome there. In terms of transport, we are aiming for train and public transport and cycling, so improve service and provide infrastructure. We also aim for EV charging and fleet renewal, and here there's a big battle in the industry as to whether there should be any conditionality in the medium to long term, and there are two sides of the story here that we can perhaps discuss a bit later on. In terms of aviation and heavy transport, what the government is expected to request, as was discussed before as well, were bailouts if and when needed, subject to a net zero strategy by 2050 and intermediate goals for decarbonisation. In terms of urban planning, what we can expect to see is an increase of low emission zones, and we have conducted our primary research in Spain at Elcano Royal Institute, and there's high public acceptance of this kind of measure. There's knowledge about the fact that most polluting cars are increasingly going to be left out of the city, and Spanish citizens seem to be on average okay with that. In terms of power, the idea is to put our NECP on steroids. We have round about 60 gigawatts of renewable power if the plan materializes, if the NECP materializes up to 2030. So that the NECP in Spain is supposed to require an investment of 241 billion euros, and 80% of that money has to come, in theory, from the private sector. So there's a question regarding whether those figures have to be rethought and whether there's going to be appetite to engage in that. But it is a government priority. And as regards energy intensive industry, again, bailouts subject to net zero plans by 2050 and intermediate goals. So that is what Spain is doing. I don't know whether perhaps I should leave the different space for consensus within Spain to a little bit later, and just leave it there and hand it over to you, Anna. And if you're interested in talking about what the different sectors in the economy are saying, because again, perhaps just very quickly, just to show you what's happening, if I may, give me a thumbs up, Anna. Yeah, okay.
Hang on, maybe also you can put your screen in bigger in the output mode, so we have the figure, we can see better the figures.
Okay, I have it on
your screen. Oh, doesn't matter.
No, it's big in mine. I'm not sure whether.
In the meantime, there is also it's useful to go into a few details, because we have a question asking exactly how the what it has been done so far to stay in track with the carbon neutrality is going to be affected by the crisis. So you were exactly saying that maybe the plans have to be changed.
I think that's the debate. If you look at, so the idea, I've given you sort of the overview of what the government is saying. If we go down to the business level, there's like two sides of the camp. In the left hand side of the screen, you see those companies that have supported an alliance for a green recovery, big companies there, Acciona, BBVA, Iberdrola, Santander, with the banks and the financial sector coming in a bit later in their support for that green alliance for a green recovery. And then we have the Spanish Green Growth Group, which is a group of 50 companies that make up a big chunk of the benchmark stock market reference index, who are supporting the stimulus packages aligned with sustainability goals and having the European Green Deal as a guideline. And they think that our NECP, again, should be put on steroids and just get on with it and meet the goals that we set out to achieve. That start in 2021 and finish in 2030, and again adopt the climate change and energy transition law, which had been requested back in 2011, and still we don't have a framework law. On the other side of the debate, we have the Alliance for the Competitiveness of the Spanish Industry, and this is the car manufacturers association, the oil manufacturers, the oil producers, the chemical industry, paper industry, etc. And what they're requesting is basically front loading the swift and quick response without any type of conditionality. They do talk about some green investments, but they stress the fact that economic recovery should go first and strings should not be attached to the stimulus packages. And I don't know whether we have time for just a very quick note on how people are feeling about this in Spain, but we can basically say that when we've asked Spanish citizens, it's a sample of 1,000 citizens. The fieldwork was conducted just before the state of alarm, so just before the great lockdown in Spain. We asked citizens in Spain about their preferences towards the European Union upcoming budget. And by and large, the question was, in which budget items would you want the money to be increased? And Spanish citizens said science and technology and renewable energies and agricultural policy, all with very high percentages. I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
So I think that we also agree with the Spanish citizens. I think that we have a lot of things to do in those sectors. I just wanted to ask Thomas to complete perhaps on the European side what it is this idea of, and Patrice of course too, how do we modify this idea of the climate law and the objectives for 2050?
Thank you, Anna. So the EU climate law has been proposed in March, actually March the 10th. So literally a few days before a lot of EU countries went into lockdown. But this law is really the European Commission's answer to a deep change that has happened in the EU public opinion over the last few years, and that's what you can see here. For instance, on the poll, what you can see here is the rise of climate change as a priority concern for European citizens, and essentially, 3-4 years ago, climate change was not considered to be a big political issue by European citizens, because only 6% of them were saying that climate change was one of the two most important issues facing the EU at the moment. And this has risen constantly alongside actually another issue, which is the environment, over the past 3 years. And this is the reason why the European Commission proposed an EU climate law at this very moment. It's really an answer to this deep structural change in public opinion. Obviously, we don't know how public opinion will evolve after COVID-19, and there may be a decrease or maybe an increase of concerns vis-à-vis environment or climate, but in any case, it's likely to remain very strong. So the political reason why the EU needs an EU climate law, why the EU needs to have climate neutrality by 2050 enshrined as an EU legally binding objective is still very much here. And the debates are continuing within the institutions. The work of the European Parliament has been a little bit delayed because they needed to go digital. And obviously for some MEPs, it's a bit hard to go digital right now. They needed to, let's say, some increase in their some capacity building here. but I think it's safe to expect that the European Parliament will have a position on the EU climate law around October. And so therefore, it's likely that we will have a final decision on the EU climate law in early 2021, so largely on track with what was expected originally. And obviously, the law will be changed by the legislators, but one thing that is certain is that climate neutrality by 2050 will be a key element, the key element of the climate law. So for instance, when I have the chance to talk to businesses, I would say, in terms of investment, you can already invest as if climate neutrality by 2050 was already legally binding at the EU level, because it's quite certain it will be.
Thank you very much for these clarifications. I would like to ask Patrice that I know you have been talking with the political arena in France. So how it is perceived from the point of view of the decision making?
Okay, in fact, we observe in France, at least in the back office, some interesting things. Because in fact that COVID crisis has emerged in a way just after the yellow vest crisis. And one of the conclusion of that crisis has been in France to create a so-called citizen convention on climate change, and I'm involved in that process for 6 months, and in fact we observe very, very interesting things because, and it was stressed by Thomas, we already observed in the past, if we observe the modification in the citizens' mind over the last year, that growth of the climate change threat and issue. And I can confirm inside of the debate of that convention that this is the case, and some of the recommendation of that convention has been delivered to the French president 2 weeks ago, and all of them go in the direction to, let's say, to sustain the effort, and moreover due to the COVID crisis, because that citizen which have been randomly selected make directly the link in their observation between the environmental and climate threat and that sanitary threat. And their recommendations are directly oriented based on that conviction that there is a package of threat, and that we need to use that leverage of co-benefits. And it leads, from my point of view, to something which is not clear for the moment, but that we will observe in the coming month. In that discussion, we have mentioned the European industry, the European institution, the European citizen, but we have not mentioned the European consumer, which is the same in a way than the European citizen. But my vision is the following: if the idea is to say that with €1 of public money invested in, let's say, in a gray recovery plan, that it will produce mechanically positive effect in terms of value, economic value creation, in terms of job creation. It is not that sure. It is not that sure, because that product and that services will have to be proposed to consumer. And I'm not sure if we consider, for example, the car industry in Europe, or if we consider, we have mentioned, Anna, you have mentioned the case of Air France, that all that industry will find in front of them in a few months the same consumer. This is something which is not clear for the moment, because all of us are still in that lockdown situation, and what we will do after that period is not clear. But we have made that collective experiment of a different way to live our daily life. We will have also financial constraint, and when we make that combination of constraint and, as mentioned by Thomas just before, that trend of threat related to climate change, maybe that the European consumer will be different after that period. And I think that we need to take it into account as to determine the most relevant recovery plan.
Thank you very much. There is just take the opportunity, a question for you, especially they saying, why is Europe the winner in green investment in your modeling?
I'm sorry, Anna, it was a question for me.
Yeah, it's for you. It seems that you are giving a premium to Europe. So is that the case?
Okay.
Is that correct?
I think that okay, I understand. I think that we have a chance, which is that we don't have roughly any more oil and any more gas resources. And then from my point of view, if we compare the situation between, let's say, Europe and US, we have more limited costs to pay to make that transition towards a low carbon economy. Because it means that behind us, we will have probably less stranded assets. And then I think this is one of the leverage which are put forward by IRENA in their most recent study.
Thank you. So it relies on the fact that somehow not producing directly oil and gas may favor some shift, I would say maybe a prompter shift towards renewable, as it is already the case. Just going back to Lara to give us also some ideas about so thinking what is going on in the renewables, because if Spain has both invested a lot in gas and renewables, so how do you see the future of those industries?
Well, I mean, according to the NECP, we are going to have auctions. We are going to have around 60 gigawatts of extra installed capacity by 2030. We are still, both with wind and with solar, in the top 10 in terms of installed capacity and penetration in our energy mix. So I think Spain is well positioned. Obviously, we had our issues with regulation in the past. So the idea is that if we manage to finally adopt the Spanish climate change and energy transition law, this will be providing the regulatory certainty that will encourage everyone to invest. Obviously, there are issues with scalability and bankability, and we all know about them, but I think that the environment pre-COVID was certainly better than it was a few years back. And I think the government and Spain in general is at a crossroads at the moment in terms of whether we move forward with those plans or we delay them and endanger not meeting our climate goals. And just very quickly to complement, if I may, Thomas's thought on citizens, what we find in our analyses is that there's this one question that we ask to different countries in Europe, and we ask them to rank in pairs of two to rank their foreign policy priorities. And what we find in Spain since 2017, but also in Germany and in France, is that climate change comes on top in terms of foreign policy priorities. But when we go and ask citizens in Spain what they do when they eat, whether they eat meat or not, whether they travel on the plane or not, and the reasons for their behaviors when they buy food or when they buy clothes, the environment is not top of their mind, is not top of the agenda yet. So we are concerned, yes, and that concern is shaking but increasing through time. But I think there's a concern action gap that we still have to bridge, at least in Spain, but also, I guess, in other countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that we are almost at the end of this webinar. If there are some questions, urgent ones, if not, I can conclude by just saying that we are facing something that is unprecedented. I think that in the latest months, the word that I have heard most in everywhere here is, in French we say inédit. So it is something that we say never seen before. And I hope that since we have something completely new, it is going to trigger new response, new answer, new investments. I don't know if we have to be optimistic. I hope so. And from the academic point of view is something that we still are going to discuss together. And so I thank Patrice from my same university, Paris-Dauphine University, Thomas from the Delors Institute. So you may find also very, very interesting analysis that is being published by the Institute and webinars, so on and so forth. Lara, she was also participating to a webinar from IDRI here in France. So stay in touch with us and also with the EIA. And I'm going to give the floor to Dave to conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Very much appreciate this. I know I have learned quite a lot. You know, IAE is based in the U.S. and it's you know, we're kind of wrapped in our own environment right now. So this has been incredibly valuable for me to learn what has been happening and is happening in Europe. So thank you very much. For everyone listening, this webinar has been recorded. It will be available on our Rewind. We are hopeful that we'll receive all PowerPoints from the panelists to share as well. If you're not already a member of IAE, we encourage you to join. Please visit us at www.iae.org. Thank you for attending. Wish you all a great weekend, and I officially close this webinar. Thank you.